Today's episode may not be about the Samurai class for 1st edition Pathfinder, but it is about the subject of power, which I've been wanting to talk about for a while now. Hello everyone, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your Master of Lore and Storyteller Extraordinaire. Now, normally this would be a day where I talk about the next part of the Samurai Guide, but I really wanted to still talk about this concept of power and, well, due to my own ADHD-ness, as well as the fact that it was a Mother's Day weekend, I really didn't get a lot of work done, and so this seems like a perfect opportunity for me to make it seem like I know exactly what I'm doing, that I'm productive and focused and all of these things. So, allow me to pull the wool over your eyes and actually talk about this weird, ephemeral concept of power, this intangible thing that doesn't really exist until people believe it does exist, and then you can have incredibly, powerfully tangible effects on the world around you, or around the players in this case, as we're going to talk about how we can use this to understand the maneuverings and workings of different nations, city-states, kingdoms, whether you're doing this for your own homebrew world, or you're using this understanding to try to add in more flavor, more details, and more political maneuverings, and all different kinds of things that could possibly be going on in already existing worlds, like, say, the Forgotten Realms in Faerun, right along the Sword Coast, the different things that might be happening between Kalimport all the way up to Neverwinter, Luskan, or all the way up to the Spine of the World Mountains and the 10 towns therein. This whole concept and idea, and having a little bit of an understanding of the nuances of it, the different ramifications of it, as well as getting a few historical examples of it, can be actually very useful, or at least I think it is. Now, with that said, there's some caveats here. I'm going to say some things from a certain position and perspective. I'm not trying to make any judgment calls on anybody necessarily. There might be some points where maybe I am, but I'm going to try to avoid that and just more talk about the concept itself while citing some examples. So just set aside any inclinations or notions that you might have for a moment and just kind of hear me out, and, you know, absolutely feel free to disagree with me, voice those opinions and disagreements in the comments down below, absolutely. Just, you know, give me a moment to hear me out. Anyways, before we get into everything though, if you're new here to the channel, go on down there, hit the subscribe button, and become a regular member here at the Gamer's Den. Or if you've already gone on ahead and done that, then go on down there to hit the like button and share the video far and wide. But now, let's talk about power, and it's an interesting thing, as I've said before, because it can come to people in any number of different ways through so many different combinations of different paths, methods, and means of acquiring power, and once you have it, you tend to have to either maintain it or grow it, usually both, and you have to use multiple means at your disposal in order to do so, because single paths or single means of maintaining power tend to be very not stable or safe or secure at all. Those tend to disappear very, very much so. But then again, more intricate webs and frameworks means more opportunities for things to go wrong and collapse. And on the one hand, that network, that infrastructure might be able to maintain and sustain larger and larger hits, but too many hits in too many different places means the whole infrastructure network can come crumbling and collapsing down. So what are some of these different means? Well, you have the physical means, the martial means, you know, physical might, strength of arms, you know, force of arms, all of these different things. That's power. That is a path to power right there. But only having violence at your disposal makes you incredibly dangerous, a liability, a much more clear and direct threat to your neighbors. You're an obvious threat. You know, think like raiding bands, you know, marauders, organizations like that. No short-term goals between sustaining themselves in the immediacy. Usually not with a lot of long-term thinking, or if there is long-term thinking, it's just revolving around that one singular strength in those instances. Those groups tend to be short-lived historically. They don't really have much going for them. And the the consequences of that can be absolutely devastating. At one point in Rome's history, they went through something like 27 emperors in 1 year. And that was because the Praetorian Guard, they would turn on their emperor. Why would they turn on them? Well, because the emperor wasn't keeping them paid in those instances usually, or was leading them to losses. So why did they install them in the first place? Well, because previously they were generals, and not only were they generals, they were good generals. They were adept generals, leading their armies to victory after victory, which keeps people paid. But once they became emperors, well, they were not usually the ones leading the military forces anymore, or at least they couldn't be the whole time because they had an empire to manage, and they proved much less adept at that. So, because the Praetorian Guard were still very much fundamentally part of the military structure, that means they weren't getting paid either. And so, there'd be this other general coming along who was popular, successful, leading the armies of Rome, their legions to victory upon victory upon victory, keeping everybody paid. So then the Praetorians would turn on the previous emperor, stab them, knife them to death, whatever the case may be, and then install this other general as emperor. Or at least that's usually how it went with that example. And that can show you right there exactly why only a path to military, or through military violence as a means of supremacy, dominance, leadership, power, it can fall apart pretty quick. Is you need to be adept at other means. So you also have the economic, but the economic means you have a lot of resources, or at least you're trying to acquire resources through trade, through different operations for, mining, logging, growing crops, raising cattle, all of these different things. Those are all under the umbrella of economic means. You're keeping your people fed, you're producing enough extra to have trade goods with other places. That can make you a very valuable partner long term, but it also means you have wealth, you have resources. And wealth and resources are a very, very, historically, very much a primary, if not the primary means of motivating people towards warfare. As looking at European history, war was definitely something that was celebrated for a lot of different groups and factions, still is today in a lot of mythologizing of different things, but it wasn't just war itself. It had to have a goal, because people want those resources, want those valuables. They want to be paid. An army can't march on an empty stomach. They need food. They need to be paid for the time that they are not growing food, especially if you're raising levies and don't have professional soldiers supported by a larger economic infrastructure, agricultural infrastructure, and all of those things. So that having resources makes you a target, and if you don't have the force of arms to back it up and defend what's yours, well, you become a little bit of a sitting duck. Now, you may have allies that are willing to come to your aid, but do you have time to wait for those allies? Do you have the means to hold off your aggressors in order for your allies to come and save you? Or are your allies about to turn on you because this larger military force, if they take you over, sure, there might be some new terms to negotiate, but they're going to be a more stable trading partner because they have the military means to hold off other attackers. So maybe it's worthwhile to make sure that they have a stable trade partner that's going to stick around for a lot longer. And this leads into another side point here. Historically, nations don't have friends. They have interests, and sometimes those interests align. Now, take that for what you will. I'm not going to make much of a judgment call on that, but that's just the reality of it. Allies, enemies, those are all circumstances of interest, and whether or not those interests conflict or align with each other. So, that's going to be something that kings, queens, lords and ladies, whatever kind of monarchy or power structure is in place, that's what they're going to be looking at. Sure, maybe on a personal level there's a friendship. I mean, gosh, prior to World War I, most of the different aristocrats and nobles, they were all related to each other. And Tsar Nicholas II was cousins with not Franz Ferdinand, the Kaiser in Germany, Wilhelm. He was cousins with Wilhelm. They had a personal relationship. They they enjoyed one another's company. They adored each other. They even tried to stop the war using the power that their crowns, the power and authority their crowns afforded them. But power and service to power, and the fact that all the armies were mobilizing and trains and timetables dominated military thinking, if one faction mobilized, the other had to mobilize, because to not mobilize meant you arrived at the battlefield second and faced an entrenched enemy that was going to gun down and bomb out all of your soldiers and leave you defeated in the war, or at least on the field, if nothing else. And nobody could afford to do that. So, conflicting interests, even though there's a personal desire to stop World War I, they couldn't do it. So, nations don't have friends, they have interests, and sometimes those interests align, sometimes they conflict. So, a nation or a city-state or whatever power structure is in place that is an economic power, they are going to need other means of defending themselves. And now another source of power is knowledge, is information. And one of the reasons Great Britain got to be so powerful was not just because of its strength of arms, particularly with its navy, its ability to project its might into different focused areas, but they also had an incredible spy network throughout history, to the point that, though I am blanking on his name, the man who founded it, when he died and his contemporaries in Spain and in other parts of Europe went, "He died! Hooray!" Having somebody celebrate the fact that you passed definitely means that you were a massive threat. So information, knowledge, all of those things are incredibly powerful and do so much for you. But you have to be able to act on the information, whether it's through economic, diplomatic, or military means. And don't forget that military means is just an extension of political means. That's all that is. Same with diplomacy. Diplomacy is an extension of political means, as is economics. Economics is an extension of political means. So, all of those things tie together and really do a lot to build up great nations. Great nations in the sense that they are great, powerful, and vast. Not necessarily that they're great or good. Power is not necessarily a good or evil thing. It's an objectively neutral thing. It's what it gets used for, and it's not always used in the most moral of means, but that's the nature of power. That's the nature of nations. Nations don't have friends, they have interests and the power to act on those interests. So, all of those things can come together there, and it just is such a fascinating thing, because you see it pop up so much through different historical circumstances, and not always with people that necessarily want it. The most prominent example I can think of that is actually in the Byzantine Empire under Justinian, Emperor Justinian. There was a point early on as an emperor during the Nika revolts. There were the chariot races. They had the blues and the greens, these different, think of them as like sports fans, sports team. I mean, they were sports fans, and they were teams that favored, the blue racer or the green racer, and they would shout Nika, Nika, as, like this chant for when their racer was going on to victory. Well, the Nika revolt, there were a number of leaders for some of the let's just go with hooligans. They were basically hooligans. They were, armed protection, rioters. They had a lot of sway in their own way. They had their own power, enough so that it was common practice for the blues or the greens, these hooligans, to be paid, to have their services rendered for, financial compensation. And they would do all kinds of things at the street level across the city, and enact the will of different political factions. Well, some of these people got rounded up and were about to be hung, and the last two to be hung, the hanging didn't go right. A leader of the blue and a leader of the greens actually ended up surviving, and they fled to a monastery for protection. And it got to the point that the crowds wanted these people spared because, oh god, what are the odds that one of each of them would survive, and all of these different things. So at the chariot games later on, the crowd was chanting and yelling for the 2 men to be spared, records expunged, and for evil officials to be removed, which included the city guard official who was overseeing the hanging. And then they called for other political figures to be removed, like the tax collector, what was his name? John the Cappadocian, if I'm remembering right. I know the Cappadocian part is right. Just sounds like a cool very, very fascinating figure. The nickname just sounds so cool. He would kidnap the wealthy to torture them into paying their taxes, because the poor couldn't pay their taxes, and the wealthy were rich enough to bribe their way out of taxes. Sounds familiar. Sorry, judgment call. Sorry, I'll stop. Moving on. So they called for evil officials to be removed. It was like, that was an odd request, because he wasn't attacking the common people, the Cappadocian wasn't, so, pretty obvious somebody that didn't like what Justinian was doing had gotten the crowd riled up, and so the crowd started rioting across the city, and Justinian thought about fleeing for a while until his wife Theodora convinced him to stay. And to be never be relieved of the purple that she wears, for she believed in the old saying that purple was the noblest shroud, because purple was a color of the nobility. So he ordered 2 of his generals, one of which was a man named Belisarius, another incredibly fascinating character, brilliant mind, brilliant military commander. Read up on him too. He called these two of his generals together, had their personal guard come into the city, and they went to the Hippodrome, if I remember right, and they cornered the rioters there, and they just marched in and just slaughtered them, just butchered them all to put down the riots. Well, I skipped a part in the story there. One of the other things that happened was people started calling for Justinian to be removed, because he was not the legitimate ruler, or at least he wasn't, because to understand this part of the story, you have to understand that he was adopted by his uncle, Justin, but his uncle Justin was not a legitimate ruler either. What had happened was, Justin was a pig farmer who went to the big city to strike it rich, to live out his big dreams, and he actually became head of the royal guard for the emperor. And when the emperor died, he left behind no direct heirs, only, different distant relations, nephews, things like that. And so, all the different political figures started backing their own favorite candidates that, would help them rise up in power, expand their influence, expand their power. And as part of that, one or a few of the different senators and faction leaders bribed Justin to try to buy him onto their side, but Justinian said, hey, why don't you just use that money to bribe people now and you become emperor? And so he did. Justin became emperor, and then Justinian became the power behind the throne in that instance, because Justinian was brilliant. His uncle had doted on him and just doled out the best education he possibly could. Any of the best tutors, the best legal scholars, military minds, everything that he could possibly get in his position, which was a decently paid position. So Justinian was capable and powerful, and that's how he came to power. But the emperor still had these other distant relations around, one of which was a nephew of his that the rioters came screaming to his house, drug him out from under his bed, and paraded him around, demanding that he be installed as the new emperor. He didn't want to be. He did not want anything to do with that. But that's one of the interesting things about the nature of power. I mean, this guy was definitely just going to end up being a puppet, at least in my own estimation, but he wanted nothing to do with power because he saw the danger that lay around it. Maybe he was worried that Justinian was going to do something to make sure that power was cut off. But as a result of these riots, Justinian ended up having to have him executed, had to have him killed, because other people around him interested in their own power, in their own selves, in advancing their own agendas and influence, all of those things, maybe none of those things, wanted to remove Justinian and put this other person on the throne. A person who had a more legitimate claim to the throne, to being emperor than he did. So, had to cut that off permanently, and had to have the man executed. Another example of this is actually, interestingly enough, and coincidentally enough, actually has to do with the Sengoku Jidai period in Japan. You could think of it as Japan's late medieval period. Tokugawa Ieyasu established the Tokugawa shogunate at the end of everything. 115, 120-ish years of war or so, started by the Hosokawa and the Yamana clans, ended with the Tokugawa shogunate coming into power. But the previous shogunate still had an heir around, and a fairly direct heir too. He was what did he change his name to? Hideyoshi Hashiba? No, Hideyoshi Toyotomi. Hashiba was what he called himself before. Hideyoshi Toyotomi ended up seizing control of the shogunate after his old lord, Oda Nobunaga, was killed in a matter of betrayal. He killed the betrayer, Mitsuhide Akechi, seized the shogunate for himself, had claims drawn up to show that he was a legitimate shogun, and produced an heir with one of his favored concubines, and this heir was still alive. And as far as I can tell, Ieyasu didn't want to kill the boy. He wanted him to live. I mean, he was sequestered in his own castle, but dude still had his own castle. Kid's mother was still around. But because he was an heir, and because the Tokugawa shogunate still had enemies displaced by the fact that in order to secure his own power, once he was firmly established and in control of Kyoto and had subdued the West, he redistributed the lands that were around Kyoto from their traditional owners, or at least, the people who had ended up laying claim to the territory and became its traditional owners. He replaced them with his own allies. So his own allies were now situated as a buffer. Those clans that made alliances and friendships with his own clan were now surrounding him, which really helped to centralize that power, brought them into centers of wealth, and really did a lot to help strengthen them and thus strengthen their loyalties to the Tokugawa shogunate. That meant all of his enemies were now displaced to other territories where they had not been the lords for generations, where they didn't have ties, where they were further and further away from these rich economic centers. Although some other areas would become the economic centers outwards, definitely the Satsuma clan being closer to Korea and China and everything, yada yada yada, a lot of foreign trade and all of that. The Tokugawa shogunate now had, all of these clans that were dispossessed of their traditional territories, who were still angry with the Tokugawa and wanted revenge. So here's this heir, a direct heir to the Toyotomi clan, the Toyotomi who had been so good to them, and at least represented an opportunity for them to really rally together and try to strike back. And from my own reading, the kid didn't really want to do any of that, or at least that's kind of what I see there. And Tokugawa didn't want to strike him down because Tokugawa had once been a hostage as well. Actually, a hostage to the Oda clan, who he later allied with. And because he knew what it was like to be a hostage, to have that hanging over your head, I really do think he was in a position where he could empathize with the kid, where he did empathize, because he wasn't as harsh or as cruel as Oda was. He wasn't as he was still a cunning leader, but he had patience and an ability to not just see other people's minds, but also empathize and put himself in others' shoes. He could not only understand how people think, but why they think that way, and I really think that made him a pretty adept diplomat, within Japan at that time, and I think he could see a little bit of himself in this kid, the heir to this clan, and in a position where he's a hostage. I don't think Nobunaga wanted to do any harm to this guy, but because all of his enemies were rallying around him, this would mean another fight, another war, and while he wasn't likely to lose, there was going to be suffering caused by it, because, maybe the leaders want to fight, but it's the people that have to fight the war, and that would be more damage, more distress, more chaos that could and probably would undermine the authority of the Tokugawa shogunate, and might get more people thinking, well, it doesn't look like the Divine Emperor is really backing him all that hard. I mean, should we really be following the Tokugawa shogunate? Because look, nothing's really changed. It's still like it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Why are we still following him when this age of peace that was supposed to be in place isn't really there? So he had to attack and siege the castle and put the kid to the sword. And kid, he was an adult, but still, it's like, I really get the sense that it's kind of a tragic thing, at least when I read it. But, still there's some other sources and interpretations out there that really point out, he was looking for any excuse he could to have a reason to put this guy down and deny his enemies a rallying point that they could use to legitimize their own claims and moves to power. So, food for thought there. But I hope this rambling tirade of different historical examples and ideas has made some kind of sense, has been cogent, or at least entertaining enough for you all to have come away with something about it, because it's definitely a fascinating subject, and you can see all these different little things play out along the way, especially when, the power that nations wield just kind of runs away from people, like with, Tsar Nicholas II and Kaiser Wilhelm. These figures that just had these, especially Kaiser Wilhelm. Germany was probably the most powerful nation inside of Europe at that time. You have the British. Anyways, I'm getting off track here. But yeah, the reins of power, it just ran away from them in that instance, and you see it run away or run to some folks that never wanted anything to do with it to begin with. And hell, Tsar Nicholas II, nobody really ever bothered to train him to hold the reins of power, because nobody really ever saw him on the throne, and yet that ended up happening. Which leads me to another interesting point about Tokugawa. He was shogun for something like 2 years, 3 years? And he lived into a fairly ripe old age, so why did he only stay shogun for 2 or 3 years? Because he retired and then installed his son as shogun while he was still alive. Now, his son was a seasoned commander, leader, and had experience leading or managing nations. Well, not nations, but his territory, but he needed to get used to the reins of power. But doing so while he was still alive ensured that nobody was going to mess with him. Nobody was going to raise up until his son was firmly in control. Because, the idea was that he would be the power behind the throne while his son learned to handle the reins of power on his own, to prepare him for the day when he would eventually die. And that's a big difference right there between Tokugawa and a lot of his other contemporaries. He had adult sons, and he had sons who were competent, experienced, and that he actively cultivated into being good leaders. At least, good in the sense that they were capable, that they were able to think ahead and manage all of these different qualities that leaders and power would need in order for that power to be stable and to be survivable. And then sometimes you still have instances where none of that matters, like the Bronze Age collapse. Another fascinating time period to learn about, because we don't really know what caused the Bronze Age collapse to happen. We have some theories, and the leading theory is multiple systems collapse, because the idea is that all of these nations, they had powerful militaries, they had powerful economics, they had agricultural means at their backs. But they still ended up collapsing, even though they had weathered natural disasters before. They had weathered famine, disease, they had weathered war, and survived for so very long to build these sprawling, complex societies. You had the Hittites, the Mycenaean Greeks, you had the Egyptians, these powerful, powerful forces that ran off of bronze, used the chariot to such powerful degrees, and they still ended up collapsing. And the idea is that multiple things went wrong at close to or near or the same time, and put too much stress on these massive integrated systems, because while a hit here or there, the larger systems are able to absorb those impacts. They can even absorb multiple impacts, but too many, and too many things collapsing or stopping all at once, like trade, like the flow of tin and copper that you need to make bronze, the time that you need to retrain up new charioteers, because you needed really experienced and well-trained people to be charioteers, meant that these societies were far too weakened to deal with any number of these things coming at them at all the same times. And so they would collapse. They would collapse under the weight of trying to maintain and sustain these populations under these horrible, rigorous conditions, to the point that nobody would come back to repopulate these urban centers that had once been sprawling, vast areas of life, culture, science, mathematics, architecture, all of these things that make societies great. And nobody would come back. Hell, writing just disappeared for the longest period of time. But what do you think? Go on down to the comments below and let me know your thoughts. Did you like today's video? Did you dislike it? Let me know in the comments down below. And remember, if you're new here to the channel, go on down there, hit the subscribe button, and become a regular member here at the Gamers Den. But with all that said, I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. Thank you all so very much for your time, and you all have yourselves a good night.